Hey guys, welcome back. Today, we're finally going to take a look at the 8 Jungian functions, as well as the 4 function axes that are created by these 8 functions, and the 4 function quadrants which come along with that. This is going to be one of the most challenging videos yet, because I need to introduce to you a lot of different concepts all at once, and then tie them all together towards the end. So if something isn't making sense during the presentation, hang on until the end, and I think all your questions may be answered. So okay, without further ado, so the 8 Jungian functions are, of course, IT, IF, IN, IS, the introverted ones, and EF, ET, ES, EN, the extroverted ones. And nowadays, these are more commonly abbreviated TI, FI, NISI, and so forth. So we arrive finally at the last missing piece of this diagram, and we ask the question, just as we've asked for every other aspect of this diagram, is there a reality to Carl Jung's categories of feeling, thinking, sensation, intuition? So as we said before, it's very easy to create internally coherent dichotomous systems. You can create an infinite amount of them, and they can all be sensible as heuristics within themselves. But we have no necessary reason to believe that they represent something biological, something innate about human beings. So what we're asking really is, outside of the system's own inner coherence, do we see some objective reality that reflects that concept? So is it somehow measurable physiologically, biologically, genetically, or what have you, in some other way that necessitates that we have these categories? So we really have to ask a very rudimentary question, which is there even such a thing as FE or TE or NI and so forth? What would it even mean for them to exist? Like in a physical context, can we locate these functions in some objective sense, right? Now, the reason we're tackling this question last is because with the 8 functions, there are many other things that have to be true objectively before you can even ask about their specific reality. So if you're starting at the top side here, and if you wanted to prove that FE is real, then you would first have to prove that extroversion is real, and then that feeling is real, and then the combination of those two would give you extroverted feeling. Or you could go the bottom-up route here, and you can try to identify whether judgment is real, and then whether extroversion is real, which would cause extroverted judgment to be real. And then from there, you could verify whether FE exists as a variant of extroverted judgment, with the other variant being extroverted thinking. So in a way, there's 2 potential ways to verify Jung's hypothesis, and we'd be very lucky to find consistent physical supports for either of these 2 routes. Or, by some even greater miracle, they might both be right as well. And here's where we had to apply another trial and error process, just as we did to try to find out whether or not there was any definitions of judgment and perception that had some sort of tangible reality. And what we found is that if we follow the bottom-up path, we actually discover more consistent and reliable connections to some sort of physicality than when approaching it from a top-down option. But now, it's kind of annoying to continually have to refer to it as bottom-up, so we could just restructure what we're looking at here and paint it this way. So kind of like inverting the tree over and looking at it the way that Model 1 actually views it. In this sense, you have judgment and perception as a primary duality, which then divides through introversion and extroversion into JE, JI, PE, and PI. And then those further divide into 2 each, to give us the 8 functions. So in this sense, FE and TE are variants of JE. Let me say that again. They're variants of JE as the core process, rather than, like, say, FE being a variant of F. So it would be incorrect to say like that somebody has feeling, which is either inner turned or outer turned. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that there is judgment that is extroverted while also having a feeling dimension to it, or having a thinking dimension to it. Whatever we understand by feeling and thinking, and which is something that we'll get to later. But in this case, feeling and thinking are almost like the last property within a chain of properties. And they are the more granular and more subtle difference. And it's the energetics that have so far been shown tentatively to have some sort of statistical reality to them. And so if FE and TE exist, they would most likely be variations of JE, the JE that we've been examining so far. So now I'm going to try to kind of like recreate the experiment that we did here for you, in the sense that we're going to see variations of JE for starters and just see what emerges, and then try to categorize or define what emerges. Okay, so here's the first sample. This is Ted Cruz, and here we go.
Concerns and his concerns about Donald Trump. You know, Mitt and I come from a different place in the political spectrum, but he's entitled to express his concern. Well, and listen, Mitt is someone I've always liked and respected. You know, his campaign was not successful, and so I think we need to focus on actually energizing and mobilizing all these folks that are coming out. Look, we're campaigning to win, and I will say, anytime you hear people talking about a brokered convention, I think that is the fevered talk of the Washington establishment. The Washington establishment is in a panic. They're confused. They don't understand what's happening. And their favorite candidates, the ones that they want to win, are not getting the votes.
So the first thing I want to point out is that we see an abundance of head shakes. There's hardly a time period that's more than 2 seconds long where he's not rattling his head side to side, right? His head is moving left to right, up and down. So for example, here, boom, you see that? The head, the way that it kind of shovel chins down, right? There's a force to that. So that's a nice forceful head nod. It's not just like a complacent nodding. It's actually more like an assertive nod, right? Okay, and here's a head shake. You see that head shake? It's also very assertive. It has this kind of forward push to it, right? And here you can see the shoulder shrug involved with a head shake. See here too? Yeah, see that? So basically all the signals are present. He's also very articulate. He hardly stops articulating the whole time. So he has fluent articulation, head shakes, head nods, gesticulations, and shoulder shrugs. So the whole repertoire of JE signals is there. And so this is very firmly a JE lead. And just as we'd expect, he has strong executive abilities. Not only has he been a senator, but he's also been running for the presidency. And there's hardly a more executive job than being the commander-in-chief of the nation. Okay, now we're going to look at Charlie Houpert. Okay, here we go.
In this video, I'm going to teach you how to read anyone. And specifically, what I want to do is give you 6 things that if you implement and think about these, you're going to know what people are thinking and feeling without them even having to tell you. And that skill is amazing. You can apply it in tons and tons of different circumstances. And that's the last piece. I want to help you learn how to apply it. Because a very, very common question that I see in the comments, and I appreciate those, but very, very common one is, Charlie, how do you make these charisma breakdowns? How do you see the frameworks that you see? And how did you learn this stuff?
Okay, so immediately we can also see that there are strong JE signals. You can see that he also has strong head pushes, for example, here. And here you can see a very accentuated hand motion. It comes down very firmly. And you can see here that his hands actually project outward onto the object, right? That there's an intrusion of his body, of his energy onto you. And in a way, he's trying to coach you through something. The message of his video is really to teach you how to have charisma, how to have charm, how to navigate your way in the social space. But it is, in some ways, different from the other video we just saw, right? For now, just hold these 2 individuals in your head as both being examples of JE in different expressions. And then we're going to go through with the next 2 pairs of samples. Okay, so next we have Chris Wallace. So first, I'm going to play the video through once and then analyze it afterwards.
Not just me, that the family came second. That's what mattered to him most. Did it hurt a little bit? Yeah, but that was him. I didn't go up against him. He just stole the interview. I told this at the memorial service, and I think everybody at 60 Minutes felt he had stolen a story from them or elbowed them out of the way. I was supposed to go over that day and do the interview. Crew's there, and they suddenly call and say, Chris Rock's not coming. Why? 60 Minutes. And that's like my worst. If it's Morley or Ed, it's not so bad. It wasn't. But he didn't give it to me. His compromise was, I'll keep it for 60 Minutes, but I'll let somebody else do it. Which actually, knowing him, was a pretty big concession.
Okay, so as we saw, again, we see the head nods are abundant, the head shakes, the shoulder shrugs, as you see here, the the head nods, as you see here. And this is a very strong head push, as you see here. It has that accentuation. So we have a very firm body mannerisms, very strong accentuations of the head rattles, and a firm command and charge, right? Now, here's where it gets interesting, because we now have 3 samples of JE types, right? But 3 is all it really takes to start to notice whether or not there's a difference. So with Chris Wallace, you might ask yourself, is Chris Wallace more like Ted Cruz, or is he more like Charlie Houpert, right? Again, we're just observing, and I'm kind of walking you through how this evolved for me as I was exploring this phenomenon. So as I saw Chris Wallace, and then after having seen Ted Cruz, I noticed that these 2 are very similar to each other. So for example, putting these 2 side to side, you can really see a resemblance. Their head shakes are of a similar velocity. They're very fast, they happen really quickly, and when they accentuate their head, it's not like a nice hit. It's kind of like a sharp, fast, like hitting a nail with a hammer. It happens very quickly. So what we're observing is a vultological similarity here. We haven't yet talked about precisely what the differences are. Right now, we're just talking in qualitative language, which is okay. This is just a way to explain it. But we're trying to be empirical here in the sense that we're building up an observational set of data. So we ask, okay, we see a similarity in these samples. Is there a psychological similarity to them as well? Well, let's see. First of all, they're both involved in the political sphere. One is a candidate, but Chris Wallace is very often the one interviewing these people. And in some ways, a news anchor is almost just as much of a politician as the politicians, because they have to think like a politician to ask the right questions and to probe in the right areas. And they're both in positions of leadership and authority. So again, we're storing information in our brain. So we want to put that on the shelf for now. And let's go towards the next example. Okay, so next we have Tony Robbins. So here we go.
They're always a business operator. And my focus is to become a business owner. How do you do that? You realize that the chokehold in the growth of your business is always the leader. And it's your skills and it's your psychology. And I found it's 80% psychology and 20% skills. So what happened was you learn how to get through that, right? And we learn how to be resourceful. When you realize that your problem is not a lack of resources, it's not a lack of money or technology or contacts, it's not. It's your psychology. Because the ultimate resource is resourcefulness.
So, as some of you may know, Tony Robbins is a kind of a motivational speaker, and he talks a lot about self-help and growth and so forth. And all of that has within it a lot of yang energy, a lot of executive ability. It takes a lot of effort to be assertive. So one of the things he talks about here is that we are the limits of our own potential, and a lot of what success is about is not so much having the resources, the financial stuff. It's about your psychology and changing your mindset can change your actions and change the effects that you have in the world. And those effects can be as big as you want them to be. So I just noticed here on the clip down here, it actually says your leadership potential as the tagline for the video. That's very much in line with, again, the JE type, the executive type that we've been discussing. But now we want to ask the question is, what do we see in Tony Robbins relative to the other JE types that we've slotted in our shelf at the moment? How does he compare to them? And I think you might agree with me that he is more similar to Charlie Houpert, which, let me put them side by side. Okay, so here we see the two together. Notice how their hands move in a similar way. They have a lot of swelling motions in how their hands gesticulate. Let's go back here. So look at that. Look at how they both, they bring it forward in a kind of up and down pattern. They kind of hit you almost like they're trying to coach you through, like empathically scooping you in to the discussion. They're very much focused on the audience, making sure the audience is following along, but also trying to have an influence on you as a person through their presentation. So these two are very similar to each other in how they present themselves. And the other two, Ted Cruz and Chris Wallace, are very similar to themselves in how they present themselves. So we saw with Chris Wallace and Ted Cruz that there was an interesting intersection in what they do and how they do it. What they do being some degree of political interest, whether it is as the interviewer of politicians or as the politician running for office, news focus, government focus, leadership focus, economics, etc. That's kind of the domain of those two. With these two guys, what do we see? Oh, look at that, very similar. What we see with these two guys psychologically is a similarity in a focus on the human being, specifically in the human being becoming something better, right? Improvements, like self-improvement. In the case of Charlie Hooper, he's trying to self-improve your skills in terms of your charisma, in terms of your capacity to read people, how you can come across better. And with Tony Robbins, he's basically telling you when you're running a business, focus less on the resource issues that you might feel and realize that it's more your psychology that may be inhibited, which is basically focus on your psychology, focus on your mind, which is a kind of, again, human-centric self-growth. So in a way, they're kind of opposite to the other two, right? Because they're kind of anti-financials in the sense that, like, yeah, they're executive, they're both have leadership capacities, but they're not talking about economic strategies and financial plans and budgets. That's not the preoccupation of these individuals' minds. Okay, so we have the beginnings of a pattern, but of course, 2 samples is really not enough. This could be a coincidence, and so we have to continue to look for more. But we can maybe start to make a prediction here. So with 2 samples, we see a pattern, and then we say, okay, if I see a pattern, then I'm going to try to see if the 3rd sample connects with that. So this is where you can start making predictions. Okay, and so we're going to look at one more pair of samples now, and we're going to start that with Hillary Clinton.
And try to be as candid as I can. I think there were several problems with my candidacy. One, the kind of leadership that I was offering based on my experience, my preparation, the ideas I had, what I knew I could do because I had served in the Senate for 8 years. There was a lot of negativity on both sides, that's true, but I came out of the Secretary of State job with a 69% approval rating. I was, by many measures, the most popular public person at that time in America, and certainly in the Obama cabinet.
Okay, so here's Hillary Clinton. Now, when we look at her Vultology, here we see the head pushes, right? The pushes going forward. And here's another one right here, right? And here we have a head shake and another head push. See? So they're everywhere. So it's a lot of head pushes, head nods. And once again, we're observing that a person that displays these head shakes, head nods, and these gesticulations connects psychologically with leadership position. And nobody would question that Hillary Clinton is a very executive person, whether or not you think she does her job well. So that should already be firmly established in your thoughts. So as a baseline, we're already establishing that those 5 JE signals do correlate with command, with being in charge, with leadership, with executive abilities, with getting things done. But now going beyond that, okay, we started to develop a tentative hypothesis, and we said that the pattern we saw with Ted Cruz and Chris Wallace could be compared against the pattern we saw with Charlie Hooper and Tony Robbins, and then we can see if we find a new sample, would the same pattern repeat? And so here we have Hillary Clinton, and now I would say that she follows in the same pattern as Chris Wallace and Ted Cruz. And let me show you what I mean.
It was certainly part of it. And as I write in the book and try to be as candid as I can, I think there were several problems.
So you can see here that both of them have a very snappy, dismissive head shakes. Like the way that their head shakes happen here, for example, Hillary, they're very quick and expedient. Here with Chris Wallace, they're also very quick and expedient. Let me play it again. Look at that here, and then look at that here, right? Very snappy and quick. Their articulation has a similar tempo and velocity. He kind of swings his head around in one kind of linear stroke. There's no swelling, there's no charming, enveloping aspect that we saw with the other 2 samples. Neither do we see it here with Hillary. There's this kind of linear, non-parabolic arc, which is actually represented here by the graph. So in this graph next to Hillary Clinton, what I'm depicting is the velocity pattern of her head movements. So when the graph here is at the bottom, it means that she is still, and then when it goes up, she's picking up velocity in the sense of like her head shakes are picking up velocity. Once they reach a certain velocity, they continue at that velocity until they drop off. So let me show you what that looks like. So notice this head shake. See, it's like boom, boom, boom. So it picks up velocity and it keeps it for the duration until it stops. This is kind of the pattern she has, and not only her, but Chris Wallace and so forth. So it's okay. So now, remember, we had this hypothesis. So now the question is, does Hillary Clinton psychologically match the pattern we see with Chris Wallace and Ted Cruz? And I would say the answer is yes. If you think of Hillary Clinton, she's known for being very steely, very dry. She is critiqued for not being warm enough, for being a little bit too mechanical or robotic, as though she can't entirely charm the audience the way that, let's say, Barack Obama has in the past. When Hillary Clinton tries to lead, she tries to lead through facts, through actions, through executive commands, more than she tries to be any kind of self-help coach or life guru, anything like that. She's not a guru, she's more of a CEO personality. But now I mentioned that there was one pair left, so let's look at the other side of this pair. And this is Oprah Winfrey. Now, again, like the other clips, I'm gonna go through it once and then explain it afterwards. Here we go.
So I could keep my feet on the ground even though I could get more shoes. And I could understand that it really was because I was grounded. I've done was doing and continue to this day to do the consciousness work. I work at staying awake. How the investment in the stakeholders, the people who you are serving, that connection between the people who you're trying to serve and sell to is equally as important as the people who you're buying from, right. Equally as important as...
We'll get to what she said in just a second, but just to show the JE Vultology, so here we see the hands doing their gesticulations, and here as well, we see the accentuated stops. It's very firm. Now over here on the side, just like Hillary Clinton, we have another graph. And this graph is also showing the velocity of the movements, but this time it's more of a parabolic arc. What does that remind you of? The way that the hand goes forward with these kind of swells, it kind of takes its time. That's the same way that we see it in Charlie Houpert and Tony Robbins. And what is she saying? The very same thing as Tony Robbins, which is working on yourself, doing the consciousness work is what she calls it. Now, doing the consciousness work is kind of a way of saying working on your psychology. She is a kind of life coach, or at least that's kind of a position that she's taken in the public sphere, because she, through her shows, she has acted as a mentor for the general population. So she has leadership abilities, just as all the others here have, but she's not at all like Hillary Clinton. Like vultologically, she's different from Hillary Clinton, right? Like that's very obvious, but also psychologically, she fits more of the life coach, guru, and consciousness worker, the self-mastery kind of psychology. That's what she's about. So here with these last two samples, if we were running an experiment, we would have made a prediction, and then we would have actually verified the prediction, because Hillary Clinton ended up being like the other two politicians, and Oprah Winfrey ended up being like the other two life coaches in their Vultology and psychology. So we have these two different realities manifesting that kind of join together. So here they are put together. On the top side, we have one group, and on the bottom side, we have the other group. All 6 samples showed strong JE Vultology, but within that JE Vultology, there was noticeable differences, which also had their own psychological matches running parallel to those differences. Okay, so now we need a language to talk about what we just saw. We can use the term dictating for the top pattern, and we can use the word handling for the bottom pattern. So by dictating, what I mean by that is the style of just telling it how it is. In other words, just dictation, just informing you of the facts. So as you saw, there wasn't much effort done to kind of cushion the gesticulations in these samples. It just kind of like on the fly, they just give it to you straight, blunt, etc. Whereas with the handling Vultology, there was JE gesticulations, but they handled you through it. In other words, they moved you along with them, shaped you like clay handling your emotional experience and making sure that your attention is connected to the beats of their hands, because they want you to really integrate what they're saying at an emotional level. And that's why I use the word handling for this style. And so here we have a few qualitative descriptive words. For the dictating group, we have snippy, blunt, sassy, jittery, matter-of-fact, and dismissive. And for the handling group, we can describe them as smooth, warm, swelling, well-timed, coordinated, and shepherding. Again, these are qualitative words. These adjectives by themselves are not to be used to type people. They're more trying to guide you to a Vultology that we just went through. And it's just trying to give you a feel for what we saw. What's more important is the literal vector movements involved in these two styles, which have a more exact terminology in the codifier, which we'll go through later. But for the time being, let's assume that we've already gone through the vector movements themselves and we understand the difference. And then we're going to ask the next question, which is, there are two Vultological contrasted styles of JE, but does that say anything about the psychology of those who have a given style? We already got a hint of that just by what we discussed about the samples we saw, but there are many, many more ways in which we can measure what those differences are between these two groups. But I'm just going to show you one dimension of difference here by looking at their books. So here on the screen we see a collage of books created by those we call the handling group, and we can look at their titles and understand a general pattern. So here we have Oprah Winfrey with her book Own It, Tony Robbins with his book Awaken the Giant Within, Ultimate Power, Charisma on Command by Charlie Houpert, the anti-pickup line, Real Habits to Naturally Attract Stunning Women, and What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing, also by Oprah Winfrey. And these are essentially the best-selling books of these individuals. So as we've said before, there's a thematic correlation we can understand here between these writers. They all have somewhat of a psychological focus, but more specifically, a psychological focus on self-growth and self-transformation, bringing out your best self, that sort of thing. Now let's take a look at the books authored by the dictating types. And these are, for example, Ted Cruz's A Time for Truth, One Vote Away, Hillary Clinton's What Happened, as well as Hard Choices, and Chris Wallace, Countdown to 1945, Countdown to Bin Laden, Untold Stories. Now, what you notice here is they all seem to have something to do with the news or with current events and just the relaying of those events. Countdown to 1945 is a bit of a set of stories about the events that took place. Same thing with the Bin Laden story. Ted Cruz's One Vote Away, How a Single Supreme Court Seat Can Change History, is once again telling you what happened. And Hillary Clinton's book is actually called What Happened. So there's in that in itself, you see the kind of matter-of-fact informational focus of the books, just kind of giving you the facts. Now, looking at book titles and trying to summarize the contents of them is one very anecdotal way to get a sense of what the differences are. And I don't want to push that anecdote too far. But I did think that this side-by-side comparison of these two books was very serendipitous because it encapsulates the difference very well. You have Oprah Winfrey's What Happened to You? And then Hillary Clinton's What Happened, right? The to you makes it personal on the Oprah Winfrey side, and just what happened is very matter of fact, an objective account of the events by Hillary Clinton. So in this side by side, you can kind of encapsulate the entire difference between the two. One is personable and one is impersonal. Let's actually look at some concrete data here because we can't just rely on anecdotes. This is just for me to kind of explain the difference to you. But here we have two other pilot studies which we've done trying to measure occupational differences across Vultological clusters. So that's what we want to see. So if we cluster Vultologies by their visual differences, right? We ask the question of, do career occupation differences cluster around these Vultological clusters as well? And well, this is what we see. So this is the likelihood of having a JE Vultology if you have a given career. And some of these connections are very strong. So for example, this first one is 84% of journalism, and then followed by 78% commentating, which means if you are a journalist, which means if you're a news anchor, if you are a reporter, then the likelihood of you having JE Vultology is about 84%. So pretty much guaranteed Communicating can include podcast hosts and so forth. Law can include attorneys and lawyers. Politics can include senators, people running for office, and so forth. Hosting can include a TV show host. Coaching can include life coaches or coaches of any kind. This graph shows JE types in general, so we have a good handle of what the Vultology of JE correlates to. But now what if we want to know if there's any connection to the two groups if we divide dictating from handling Vultologies? Well, this is what happens when you do that. It's on the dictating side that we see the majority of the news anchors, journalists, commentators, lawyers, attorneys, politicians, and those in communicating. But it's on the handling side that we mostly see life coaches, athletes in leadership, health, and religious leadership. So notice that when we parse these two apart, we actually do get a meaningful difference in their career and occupations. Now, when you just see a list like this with 5 items, it's not really grasping at what's actually happening completely. So I put together a collage to show you what this actually looks like. So here's what the dictating group looks like. They're very well represented in law as lawyers and attorneys, or in politics as senators and so forth. So this collage captures kind of the essence of those occupational differences. Now, on the other hand, the handling types dominate in the life coaching careers, and they're well represented around athletes such as bodybuilders, and they can be found in mentorship programs, and they have community leadership skills as well. So coming back around to the original question we started with, we can now ask the question, do we actually see psychological connections to these different Vultologies? And if you consider occupational data to be a form of psychological data, then the answer is yes, we do. And so what we've done in Model 1 is we've attempted to describe, and average out these differences in psychological profiles, which you can find here at the links on screen. Now, this is the critical part where I try to connect this phenomenon to Carl Jung. So the dictating Vultology that we just saw corresponds roughly to Carl Jung's TE. And so for the time being, I'm going to call it TE in quotes. And also the handling Vultology corresponds to Jung's description of FE. So we'll tentatively put that in quotes as well as FE. Now, the reason why I'm putting this in quotes is because when you look at the psychological profile that we've extracted from these individuals by just observing them and then noting their differences and then writing those differences in profiles, when you compare that to Carl Jung's descriptions of TE and FE, there is overlap, but there's not 100% parity. They are quite similar, but they're not interchangeably similar. So for example, if you only relied on Carl Jung's profiles in a verbatim sense, and you just looked for someone around you in your environment who psychologically matched that verbatim description, like they could describe themselves that way, they may or may not necessarily have a handling Vultology. And I'm going to talk at the end of the video about how to address different typing systems and how Model 1 should be looked at in relation to other ways of typing that have come before it from other models. So hang on for that, and we'll get to that at the end of the video. So now we're going to take a closer look at JI and see if we can also find variation within that group as well. So now we're going to go through various 30-second clips, beginning first with Marilyn Monroe. Okay, here we go.
Well, not exactly a word. I said, and then,
Skada ho, skada hey.
skada who, skada hey. Greatly. I think when John Huston wanted me for the part in Asphalt Jungle, and I think when Billy Wilder wanted me for the part in 7-Year Itch, I think that was very important. Also, working with my coach, Natasha Lytez.
Okay, so what you saw here was a strong JI Vultology. If we look here, she often disengages down as she goes into herself. So when there's introversion, there is a disengagement from the environment. There is a retreat of her energy into a kind of contraction. So for example, here she's disengaged down, and here as well, and here as well. And notice that she's not very jumpy. She's not very bubbly or swaying to the sides. She remains somewhat vertically positioned where she is and kind of softly contained. She has what's called a receding energy, which we saw earlier in the signals. So that's how we know that she's a JI type. Okay, so here we have another actress. This is Rooney Mara.
Your credits started in 2006, I think.
Yeah, I guess I've been acting professionally or trying to act professionally for 10 years or almost 10 years, yeah. It was just something I always loved growing up. You know, I grew up with my mom taking me and my sister to, no. I like to be with, you know, it's not that I like to go out and I like to hang out with friends, but I don't like being in loud, crowded spaces. It's very overwhelming to me.
So again, we see very strong JI Vultology. Let's go through a few things here. Here, for example, we see her eyes kind of slowly drip, drip, and then they fall all the way down, right here. Now, look at that hand gesture. It's kind of soft, but then it retreats down. After she's kind of faintly trying to put her hand out there, then it kind of retreats again, and she kind of, it kind of collapses towards the midline of the body. Everything kind of contracts a little bit. Here again, we see the eyes disengaged down. Notice again how her shoulders and her elbows are kind of tucked into the body in a very rigid way. She's not really moving around or swaying. Here again, you can see how retreated she is within her interior, close to the chest. So I want you to hold in your mind the image of Marilyn Monroe and Rooney Mara, and we're going to just continue to gather more information, okay? So this is a volunteer for cognitive type. This is Emily. And the reason why I'm relying on volunteers instead of famous people is actually because the majority of where we find JI types is actually within the civilian space, not within the celebrity sphere. And so some of the best footage we have of them in their more normal state comes from individuals we've encountered throughout this research project. And Emily's been very gracious to allow us to add her video to the database. Okay, so let's take a look.
Share the money with my family and save it, and not spend much of it, maybe give some to charity, and then just save it and make sure that we have enough. Probably reading my my book that I'm reading, which is an Agatha Christie mystery.
Okay, now look at what we see here. We see the eyes disengaging down again. Here we see the receding energy. Look at how the body kind of folds in while the eyes disengage down. Yeah, she has a moment or two of bubbling momentum. But here, once again, we see a very strong JI Vultology. So overall, we see a very strong JI Vultology. So now that we have 3 JI samples, we ask the natural question of, is Emily more like Marilyn Monroe or more like Rooney Mara? And I think you might agree with me that she is very similar to Marilyn Monroe, and I'm going to put those two side by side here. Okay, so we're going to play these together really quickly.
Exactly a word. I said, and then, got a house, got a head. Got a who,
You see the
got a head.
You see the similarities here.
Greatly. I think when John Huston wanted me for the part in Asphalt Jungle, and I think when Billy Wilder wanted me for the part in 7-Year Itch.
So as you can see, they're both kind of shriveling and shrinking down together at the same time, but there's something very affected in how they do it, right? So they seem to have this kind of emotional affect that is seeping out of them, and this kind of sensitivity and softness and almost bashfulness. In the case of Marilyn Monroe, the bashfulness comes out very nicely in moments like this.
Who's gonna hate? Who's gonna hate?
That kind of deep breath she inhales is very soft. And here with Emily, after she says save it, we see the same sort of smile.
Save it?
The kind of breathy, the affective expression. So it looks like they have this affective expressivity combined with going into themselves. It's almost a connected phenomenon. Now, we don't see the same thing with Rooney Mara. So let's play Rooney Mara side by side with Marilyn Monroe to show what that difference looks like.
Yeah,
Not
I guess
exactly a word. I said,
I've been acting professionally or trying to act professionally for 10 years or almost 10 years.
who's gonna hey? Greatly.
It was just something I always loved growing up, you know, my
So Rooney Mara is much more dry when it comes to her emotional energy, whereas Marilyn Monroe here
I think when John Huston
has this affect in her voice, this kind of soft gentleness, and Rooney Mara's voice
I grew up with my
is much more flat, but also her cheeks are much more flat, and her body overall isn't exuding very much emotional energy. Now we're going to look at a fourth sample. Like Emily, this is also a database volunteer, and this is Nadia. So we're going to look here at just a 30-second clip.
In one hand, I think I would like to be any lead. Like, I feel good among any leads in the monkey business group, for instance. It really feels like easy to chat with them and to talk about anything. Really, like, I have just focused more on NE and FE interests because I've been fetishizing those.
Okay, so firstly, let's look at the JI signals. So again, we see the rigid posture. You can see how vertical she is. Actually, she's one of the most distinct examples of this kind of retreating into the center and being rigid. And look at this, is such a characteristic JI signature. The eyes are also disengaging down, energy is going into herself. Here she does a hand gesture, which very quickly kind of retreats back, and her eyes disengage to the ground. And she's always coming back to that center rigidity with a very strong pausing. So she pauses and freezes her body for various moments at a time. So she's very clearly a JI type. But now, of the 3 JI types that we've seen so far, she seems to have more in common with Rooney Mara. And let's look at these two side by side. Okay, ready? Here we go.
Your credits started in 2006, I think.
Yeah, I guess
Hand,
I've been acting professionally or trying to act professionally for 10 years or almost 10 years, yeah.
So notice that same dryness that we saw in Rooney Mara's expression, the kind of lack of affect, the kind of neutralization of the cheeks, of the body. That same thing is present within Nadia. They both seem to introspect with a kind of an emotional removal from the environment. That's very different from, for example, these two.
greatly.
So you see the difference, these two are much more affected in their introversion. Now, to get a better sense of this vultological difference, we're going to look at one more set of 2. Beginning here with Amanda, who is also a very generous volunteer in the database. And here we go.
Where'd you get it? Maybe you better do that one first. Is it hard or easy for you to express your feelings? Hard. Hard, we've noticed. It's just from this interview. What would make it easier?
Everybody got really cool on a lot of stuff really fast.
All right, so that's Amanda. And I'm sorry, Amanda, for putting you on the spot here, but thank you so much for letting us use your clip. So what do we see here? Again, we see the tight vertical posture that's very rigid and held together very privately. We see here, for example, in this movement here, we see a tendency to kind of shrivel in. Notice, look at her neck, how her neck is kind of tucking itself into her body. Things tend to tuck themselves into close to the vest with JI types. And she does not have a very fluent articulation. Her articulation is very sparse, very few words, and generally trying to retreat from the object. And she also fits the pattern that we see with Marilyn Monroe and Emily, as we can see here.
And then,
Is it hard?
Got a who's gonna hey? Greatly.
You see there, both of them have that same kind of shy, sheepish bashfulness and emotional affect radiating from them, right? The same thing as Emily. And now we're going to look at Bella, who's also a very generous volunteer. So thank you so much for adding your video here. So here we go.
My philosophy?
Metaphysics and philosophy are different things. Well, philosophy can be a lot of different things. I mean, ultimately, I think the answer is that I really don't know. And that's because philosophy itself has its limitations.
As we saw here, there's the body again is retreating with the shoulders and elbows being tucked in. We have the eyes disengaging down here, kind of a rigid, unmoving verticality. And when she has hand gestures, they come in and they quickly kind of retreat back without having too much force to them. So we see all the signals here of a JI lead type. As far as comparison to the other samples we saw, we see a very strong comparison to Nadia and Rooney Mara. Here, for example, let's put these two side by side.
In one hand, I think I would like to be any lead. Like, I feel good among any leads in the monkey business group, for instance. It really feels like
They're practically the same in terms of their Vultology. It's very similar. They have like this identical twin sort of look to them, almost like the same person born twice. The more identical the two Vultologies of any two strangers are, the more similar their psychologies are speculated to be. So here are our 6 JI leads. And as you can see, in the top area, we have one group, and in the bottom area, we have the other group. In the top, we have the more affected, emotionally radiant group, and in the bottom, we have the more emotionally stoic types. And we can also give these two groups names. The top group, we're going to call radiating because they radiate out emotional energy. And then the bottom group, we're going to call withholding, which means emotionally held back, affectively contained. And so here's a set of words that can be used to describe the qualia emitted by the radiating group, and these would be unbridled, spontaneous, affective, radiative, bashful, and sullen. Now, sullen we didn't get to see, but that's when they look more morose or upset. But you know, in these few samples that we saw, they were all kind of smiley and happy, but they can also be very sad and upset. And when they're sad, they have this kind of sullen poutiness to them. So it's not just about joy, of course. Everybody has the capacity for every emotion. It's about radiating out whatever emotion they happen to be feeling. So that's the key characteristic of the radiative types. Now on the bottom side here, with the withholding types, the qualia that they generate can be described as one that is neutralized, composed, courteous. And we didn't get to see this very much, but whenever these types actually do end up coming forth with a kind of emotionality, they do so in a way that is more polite, and it is not spontaneous. So the top radiating group is very spontaneously affective, and the withholding types are courteous in their affect. Their affect comes out when they allow it to come out and in the ways that they allow, otherwise they withhold it. Another word here is placid. And lastly, they can be described as unflappable and stoic. Now, the radiating types I described as unbridled and spontaneous. That actually goes way further than just the body. It actually applies to the muscles of the face. So here what you see on screen are some GIFs showing the accidental nature of the radiating types' mouth expressions. They don't seem to be trying to give a presentation. They're almost just like being themselves, and that's kind of coming out as it will in a kind of quirky way, I guess. So you might have noticed by now, but the JI types also seem to have this duality to them that relates to one side being personal and the other side being impersonal. In this case, the radiating types have a much more personal Vultological signature, and the withholding types have a much more impersonal Vultological signature. And personal and impersonal here simply refers to their presentation style, not necessarily whether or not that, you can get along with them or not. So now we ask the next natural question, which is, do these two visual clusters correspond to any psychological reality. So here is a collage of some of them. You have here Madonna, you have Prince, you have Michael Jackson, you have Lady Gaga, Marilyn Monroe, Bjork, Kate Bush. And some phrases that can capture what's common among all these individuals is that they're very self-exposing. They're very unapologetic, also very unconventional, and they're very unfiltered, and they have a very "this is me" expression to themselves. So for example, Madonna is known for her very sexually explicit displays, and Prince also here is giving a sexual display. Michael Jackson has been known to have these very erratic behaviors that don't seem to read the social environment very much, doing things that only appeal to him and no one else. And Bjork famously goes with these very elaborate presentations which, no matter how bizarre they might appear to others, seem to feel right to her. So there's this very autonomous expressivity that comes out however it will, which necessarily makes it offbeat, but they're okay with that. So they express themselves artistically in very idiosyncratic ways. So this idiosyncratic expressivity connects to what we saw previously, which is a very unbridled, spontaneous, emotive expression. Now, on the opposite side of things, when we look at people who are withheld in their Vultology, what we see is a little bit of a different focus. Well, first of all the JI types, you'll see this in the database, they all are artistic in their focus. They're all very creative in the sense that they're strongly represented in music, in art, or in any kind of production that has room for that self-expression. But within that domain of self-expression, when it comes to the withholding types, you find some individuals like Marques Brownlee, Tony Hawk, and Elon Musk. And people like them are somewhat more impersonal in their focus. Marques analyzes modern tech, Tony Hawk is a skating specialist, and Elon Musk is an inventor who thinks from first principles. Now, when it comes to the women, now we should understand in general, by the way, that there's an intersection here between men and women, because women are more people-focused, while men are more mechanically inclined, statistically speaking. And these are male and female psychology differences, which are going to intersect with all the types and all the Vultologies that we're looking at here. So within this group of unflappable individuals, the women are going to be a little bit more socially oriented. But nevertheless, they still are not offbeat the way that we saw the radiating types be. For example, let's take Taylor Swift, who is very well known for hitting just the right social notes with almost every one of her songs. She has this tendency to be very polished and to present songs that capture the zeitgeist, and she does it through her own storytelling, of course, but she never does anything erratic, bizarre, or out there in the kind of way that we see with someone like Bjork. So just like I did with the JE types, to give a little anecdotal comparison here, on the left-hand side we have Bjork giving a presentation where she's expressed in a way that suits her, that feels like her essence, and the message that we get from that is, "This is me." Kind of like she is embodying her truth. Whereas Taylor Swift here on the other side, the message that she gives off is more, "This is my best." She's trying to give a more pristine presentation, which is more analytically controlled versus the more spontaneous, uncontrolled expression of Bjork. So the difference here, again, isn't a matter of what they do, but it's in how they do it. And we'll get deeper into why that happens psychologically later. Right now we're just painting an initial picture. Now, so from a more data-driven approach, this is a graph showing all the JI types' general occupation distribution. Mind you though, as I said, JI types are underrepresented in the public, which in a way makes sense because they are so withdrawn by definition. And if what we're saying is that JI types are introverted or withdrawn from the object, you would expect them to be less visible. But here's what we tentatively see so far. Just in the public space, we find them most commonly in dance and in beauty, such as in fashion or modeling, in founding, which is like as founders of institutions, which is not the same thing as a CEO, because you can be the founder of an idea of an institution and then have a CEO that you hire to do all the executive work, but you primarily were in charge of creating something that had a vision and a dream to it. Art and music, of course. Now, so thinking back on the JE, you can see there's quite a big difference just in JE careers versus JI careers. So you could literally look at a person And if they have JE versus JI Vultology, you can distinguish which one is more likely to be a dancer or an artist or a musician, or which one is more likely to be into law, politics, and so forth. Now, we did also measure statistical differences between the radiating types and the withholding types. But bear in mind, this is coming from a relatively small sample group. But even so, we did find some differences here. For example, the radiating types are represented in dance at a ratio of 40%, whereas the withholding types are represented in dance at 20%. So twice as much for the radiating types. The second one is art for the radiating types and being a founder for the withholding types. So the withholding types are more likely to take a conceptual idea and turn it into a startup, whereas the radiating types are more likely to focus on their own self-expression. Number 3 for both of them is beauty. Number 4 for the radiating types is music. And number 4 for the withholding types is philosophy, which is again a more analytical interest. And number 5 for the radiating types is mysticism, while number 5 for the withholding types is acting. So they're both artistically and creatively inclined, but the radiating types have an additional layer of esoteric and artistic focus, and the withholding types have an additional layer of theoretical, philosophical focus. Now, just as before, we've looked at dozens of examples that have these two Vultology clusters, and we kind of extracted out profiles from them. And we call these profiles FI for radiating and TI for withholding. And these are again in quotes because they're not 100% identical to the profiles that Carl Jung wrote in his Psychological Types book. Okay, so here we have 2 variations of JE and 2 variations of JI, and we call these dictating, handling, radiating, and withholding. And they appear to correlate to TE, FE, FI, and TI according to Carl Jung's definitions. The correlations are not identical to Carl Jung's definitions, which is why we have quotes around them for now. But what I want to show you is this. When we take a look at these 4 visual clusters, we try to measure whether or not there's any connections between these 4 Vultologies, or are they just kind of indifferent to one another. What we actually find is that no, they're not indifferent to each other. There's actually a pattern within it, and that pattern looks like this. There's actually a strong statistical connection between a dictating Vultology and a radiating Vultology. And there's a strong statistical connection between a handling Vultology and a withholding Vultology. So to organize it differently, it looks a bit like this, where dictating and radiating are strongly correlated, and handling and withholding are also strongly correlated, which is rather odd to think about because one is coming from a JE and the other is coming from JI in both cases. But a way to visualize what this actually means in practice is if a person's JE is dictating and like blunt and sassy and dismissive, then their JI, if whenever they have moments of JI, because of course, remember, everybody oscillates between the four energetics, right? If a person's JE is the dictating, blunt, sassy, and dismissive, then when they express JI, it will be radiative and bashful and giddy and so forth. So you can predict what kind of JI a person will have by what kind of JE they have, and vice versa. So for example here, if it happens to be that a person's JE has a warm, handling quality to it, it will also follow that when they go into JI, their JI mode will have an emotionally neutralizing, withholding Vultology to it. Now in Model 1, from a theoretical perspective, what this really means is that one of the 2 energetics will have the personal element to it, and whatever the opposite is will have the impersonal element to it. So for example, TE being impersonal will be connected with FI, which is personal, and FE, which is very personal when it comes out, will be connected with TI, which is very impersonal when it goes in. And when you see this symmetry happening, which we'll go through the samples more so you can see it for yourself, it's really kind of a shocking thing to witness, because you're literally seeing a duality at play. And this is why in Model 1, we believe in function axes. These are essentially the function axes expressed in Vultological form. Now these 2 axes, when we combine together the Vultologies of the 2 clusters, we come up with a meta cluster of Vultologies which correlate all together as a kind of totality on both sides. So in the case of TEFI, the total cluster that involves both polarities is called Candid. And the reason it's called Candid is because so TE, when it comes out in a very dictating way, in a matter-of-fact way, it is very candid in how it comes out. But it's also candid when it comes out in FI in these radiative expressions. In both cases, there's a very frank and direct expression of the self, either bluntly with JE or radiatively with FI. Oppositely, when it comes to the FE and TI axis, together, when we put the two visual clusters together, what we call that is a measured Vultology. And that's because this axis is very measured in how it presents itself. In the case of FE, it's very measured in its presentation. It is very intentional in how it comes across to you. But with TI, it is also measured in what it doesn't express. So the entire axis is always measuring its expression. It either comes out the way it wants to with FE, or it doesn't come out at all in the case of TI. So as a whole, the TE-FI axis is candid and the FE-TI axis is measured, and this itself is a type of duality between the two axes. Now, as I've said before, the aim is to quantify every part of the theory with some sort of concrete study or some sort of measurable result that can be replicated by others, right? And so that is also the dream when it comes to deciding whether or not a candid Vultology is exclusive to a measured Vultology. It may be possible with more research to objectively establish the existence of function axes, which to my knowledge, nobody has even come close to doing, because again, it's such a high level concept that requires so many other things to be true for us to even ask the question of the trueness of itself. And this is a study that's actually up and coming. So at the moment, where we are with this video series, I've kind of taken you to the edge of where we are currently with our studies. So internally, those of us that have been working on this theory suspect that there is a measurable duality, a mutual bimodality between candid and measured Vultology. But even those of us who've studied this for a while acknowledge that it is not a perfect exclusivity. There's some degree of mixing between the two, which is fine, because everything in nature, like anything involving something as messy as expression, can't be a clean-cut either or. Even gender isn't either or at 100% fidelity, and neither does it need to be in order for it to be true. But the only thing that is required for it to be true is for this bimodality to be largely contained in two camps, less so than being in the middle. And that does seem to be what we see, which might mean that despite the fact that some people are ambiguous in their signals between the two, there may be a real genetic reality behind this if we see two camps largely being represented in the general population. The hypothesis goes that this personal or impersonal aspect may have started off one way, and then it might have bifurcated and flipped around to create the other axes. And we don't know which one would have come first, but let's say that the FE-TI axis was first. Then at some point in evolutionary history, whatever aspect of cognition handles personal or impersonal psychology might have flipped itself around and connected itself to the opposite side, so that we have an impersonal externality with a personal internality, or vice versa. But we'll get more into that hypothesis later.